Okay. Okay, I think we are ready to start. It's time. Welcome to the September 2021 APAMEI monthly online forum. I'm broadcasting now from Aoyama Gakuin University in Tokyo, Japan. I think we are ready to start. It's time. Wait. Welcome to the. Sorry about that. Okay. Yes, we are broadcasting live on YouTube, and that was the delay from YouTube playing in the background. So it's a pleasure to see you all here today. We have been doing these monthly forums now for 1 year after the pandemic started. This is our 13th online forum, and we have been joining people from all over Asia and around the world to do these for the past year. We have been exploring education in a post-pandemic world. When we started these, we were looking forward to a post-pandemic world. Here we are 1 year later. We're still in the midst of a pandemic world. But these important issues in education need to be held today. And our theme today is international human rights. We have three wonderful speakers lined up. Dr. Nishitani, Professor Emeritus of Aoyama Gakuin University, is going to be speaking on human rights and Christian education. Cade Mosley, researcher with Human Rights Now, and who also teaches human rights at Hosei University, will be speaking on the foundations of international human rights. And Dr. DeLupio of De La Salle University in the Philippines, from Manila, is going to be talking about human rights in the Filipino context. So we have quite a lineup this morning, this afternoon. Actually, because this is international, it's this morning, this afternoon, this evening, and tonight, wherever you are. It is a pleasure to welcome everyone here. Let me just check our participants. If Bishop Nakpil has joined us, I will ask him to do our opening prayer at this time.
Yeah, Bishop is here.
Wonderful. Yes, Bishop Nakpil, can you please bless us with the opening prayer? You are muted, I see. Yes, Bishop? Yes, Bishop, I noticed that your mute is off. And it's back on again. I always admire Bishop Nakpil at this age, keeping up with technology. It's impressive. Bishop, we can see you, but we cannot hear you.
Oh,
now we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paul. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. Thank you, Bishop. Can you go ahead and open our meeting with a prayer?
Let us pray. Our Father, we thank you for this forum that APAMEI has established for the benefit of our member schools. We thank you for giving us a part of your mission through education. And we ask that you enable us to do it to the best that we can, so that your name may be glorified, and our schools and the students and faculty may become channels of your blessing. May you also, Lord, bless this meeting that is about to take place. May you make of it a blessing to all of us, especially to those whom you have engaged to be part of it. Thank you, Lord, for your presence. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Bishop. International human rights. That is our topic today. Human rights have long been a very important part of education in Methodist related schools. This event is sponsored by APAMEI, the Asia Pacific Association of Methodist Educational Institutions. And in our member schools around the world, we are teaching about human rights. We are advocating for human rights. And through our forum today, we hope that this will be an occasion for students and faculty who are joining us to think deeply about human rights. What does it mean? Where do they come from? Why is it important? We're going to look at this internationally, and especially then from the context of the Philippines and then Christian education in Japan. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is a researcher who is working with Human Rights Now, which is an international human rights organization. They have offices in many nations around the world. They are connected with the United Nations. He has been in Japan off and on since the year 2000 and has been here working with Human Rights Now since 2013. And he also teaches human rights at Hosei University here in Tokyo. And so with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Cade Mosley to take the topic of international human rights.
Thank you so much for that nice welcome. Let me actually do have a page that I want to put up, which will be this one for now. Let me see if you can see that. This is kind of an outline. I'm adapting this from a class I've given. Do you see what are human rights?
Yes, we can.
Good. So Paul asked me to speak kind of at a higher level of the kind of foundations of human rights, especially from a legal perspective, the way a lawyer would think about it. So later we'll talk about it from a religious Christian perspective. I wanted to give the perspective of a kind of more universal, in the sense of, well, how a lawyer thinks about it and how someone practicing in international law that doesn't want to be specific to one religion or one culture. We have a specific way of thinking about human rights. And I wanted to give you this kind of way of thinking. And it follows these principles that you see right in front of you. So when you ask a human rights lawyer, what are human rights? I sometimes ask my students, what do you think human rights were? And I've seen some presentation by students. I remember they made presentations about human rights issues, and one group of students made about queuing in line. You want to be respectful in queuing in line or using your phone on the train. In Japanese, what we would call manners. And I thought, yeah, it's a really nice thing to do, but we wouldn't use human rights for that, this kind of issue. So the way a lawyer thinks about human rights, it's very specifically international human rights. It's a legal obligation. Human rights are laws from a human rights lawyer's perspective. So we don't actually derive the meaning from morality or from a religious tradition. We derive them from legally binding rules, obligations, legal obligations. And so this is the kind of philosophy of positivism. Countries are obligated to follow human rights because they joined them by law. And the first thing you need to know about legal obligations is they always have a source. That's where they really come from. And in international law, there are two basic categories of sources. There are treaties, which is laws that are actually written down and then the country takes them back to their home country, and then they adopt them as their own domestic law. So that makes it law inside the country. And then we have something called customary international law, which is they're not actually written down, but every country agrees in their practice that this is binding law, even without writing it down. And then we have something called general principles of law, which are things like, in interpreting, if you had two treaties, the one later in time would take precedence over the one previous, kind of these kind of logical principles that every country agrees on. So this is the way we think about human rights. There's no international parliament or legislature where these laws come from. States will bind themselves by accepting these obligations. That said, there is a kind of natural law thinking that still comes in through the back door. So there are certain core rights that even if the government disagrees about this, the international community thinks they're so important to human dignity, to protecting humans, that we still bind countries, even if they themselves wouldn't agree. We have a Latin term, jus cogens, for these kinds of laws. And there are things like, extrajudicial killings, slavery, torture, genocide, the most serious human rights violations. You won't find governments today at least saying that they accept these. But even if they tried, the international community would refuse to allow them. These are considered binding by the international community consensus. So once we've identified that human rights are laws, where do we get their content? What do they tell us to do? And that's the next line you'll see is human rights laws give you standards. They tell you exactly how to act and how not to act. They tell you what you can do. You know exactly when your behavior is violating a human right. And if it's not clear, when governments are trying to follow human rights in their practice, in their domestic practice, if you have a government that is thinking, maybe I want to violate this human right, what they sometimes do is they will make the law very, very ambiguous. So it's not clear when you're following and you're not following it. So from a legal perspective, even if the government making a law ambiguous where you don't know whether you're following it or not is itself a kind of violation. Human rights need to be clear standards because we want to make sure you can't use ambiguity or confusion to violate it without looking like you're violating it. We talk about human rights as two sides. So human rights are a legal obligation. We think about in terms of, if you think in terms of law, if you think just in terms of the simple vision of a court case, you always have two sides of the case, and then the judge in the middle. So we also think in terms of these kind of three different parties. So we have duty holders and rights holders. So these are the two sides of human rights. I actually think I have a better slide for this. Here we go. Rights holders and duty holders are the two. So every human right, if you say, for example, freedom of speech, right to life, one is the party that has to follow that rule. And if they don't follow that rule, they've had a legal violation and there should be some consequence, some punishment. And then the rights holder, which is the person, the potential victim that can claim, I had a right to this and you took it away. And they would be the one that brings the case. So these are these two sides. And the thing to know is the duty holder is almost always the government. So if your friend tells you to shut up for a minute, and then sometimes people want to say, I have a freedom of speech. In international human rights law, private people can commit, they can do bad behavior, but the obligation actually goes to the government. It's the government's job to stop bad behavior, to stop killings. If someone murders you, the right to life actually attaches to the government if they don't stop the killing. So in international human rights law, it's almost always the government's duty. So the government has three kinds of duties. It has to stop itself from violating human rights. Most of the worst violations usually come from the government itself through its security services like the military or police. So it has to stop its own actors from violating people. If private people inside the country violate rights, it's the government's duty to protect the population by stopping those private people from violating rights, to punish them or have an investigation. And then a third category is duty to fulfill. Sometimes the government's not just stopping bad behavior. Sometimes the government has to take positive action, like building schools for the right to education or hospitals for the right to health. So It's usually what the government has to do. That said, more recently, other actors have been started to actually have direct human rights obligations, like multinational companies that act a lot like governments, rebel militaries. These groups like this that are not states are starting to have duties under international law. And that's a good example to understand that human rights law is actually evolving. It's not the same as it was 50 years ago when the international system was created at the United Nations. So there are new developments. And one of the new developments is it's moving away from only states being duty holders, but these other actors. And then as for rights holders, who has a right to claim a violation if a violation occurs, to claim the right? Traditionally, it's people inside your territory. So here in Japan, the Japanese government has a duty to protect rights of everybody inside the territory. I'm a foreigner, but I'm still inside the territory, so I still have the right to claim the most basic human rights here. Sometimes you can have rights in other countries, like if you're occupying it, but that's a special kind of case. And then speaking of rights holders, the ones we care about most are the vulnerable, especially speaking of human rights workers. We start with the most serious cases and kind of work our way down. So our most focus and attention will go to the most vulnerable rights holders. And especially the most important above all are the invisible ones. The people that are most vulnerable to human rights violations are usually invisible. It's people like homeless or migrants, people that don't speak the language, or people that are despised by the majority group around them. That are the invisible ones. And the thing about being invisible is it's difficult to see the violations occurring to them. You have to actually do work to find these people. You have to do investigations and interviews to actually find where violations are happening. So that's rights holders. And one of the key parts is we have to have a third party between these two. We have the duty holders and the rights holders. We need a party in the middle. And that's what we call the enforcers. You need something like a court that will decide whether the rights holder gives a complaint, this violation occurred. We need some institution in the middle that will investigate and decide whether there was a violation, and if there was, make sure there's a legal consequence. And we call that the enforcer. So in domestic law, that's usually going to be the domestic courts, and if someone's punished, we have domestic prisons. On the international level, we have some international courts, but we don't have a general international court for these kinds of human rights violations. The first responsibility actually goes to the domestic government. And here you kind of see the central challenge of international human rights law. In English, we have this expression, the fox guarding the chickens problem. It's if you're worried about, if often the violations occur from state actors themselves, from the police and the military, you may have the problem that if you have a domestic court that's enforcing that right, you may have a fox guarding the chickens problem, which is, can you trust the courts to punish its own government? And in many countries or contexts, the court may actually not want to side with the victims. They may actually side with the states. And this is one reason why international human rights law is on the international level. If we could protect all these rights on the domestic level, we wouldn't need international human rights law. The reason why we need it on this international level is when there are all kinds of problems why the domestic level can't, and sometimes it's not always, sometimes it's by intention. They really don't like this group, or they want to maintain their power. And other times it's just capacity problems. The police don't have the resources to investigate and solve these kinds of problems. So we have obligations on the international level where the international community can, help with the investigations, help identifying violations. If the courts have no capacity to have trials, to actually institute international courts that will see them. So this middle group, this enforcer, is kind of the central reason why we need international human rights law. And then, like I said, if you have a legal obligation, one of the most important things is you need to have a legal consequence at the end. Human rights law only really works if there's a remedy for the victim at the end of the day, and if there's punishment for the violator. So we call this kind of legal consequences. And this is one of the challenges, again, of international human rights law is it's very difficult for international institutions to make sure there's a legal consequence, to make sure the perpetrators get punished, and to make sure the victims get some kind of remedy. We have things like the Security Council and international courts that can sometimes do this in special cases when the international community agrees to have some, like the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. But generally, there's not an international enforcer. There's not an international police department or courts. So a lot of the actual practice of international human rights law, we call the term we may use as administratification. It's very administrative. A lot of it isn't actually about sending police to arrest somebody. A lot of it is actually more what we call administrative. We require the government to compile reports and data on following human rights obligation. So there's a lot of people submitting reports, and then NGOs like mine will submit our own reports about these human rights violations. We're keeping the governments honest. The governments, of course, want to give a rosy picture about their behavior, but if they leave something completely out, then the NGOs will fill that gap. And so there's an incentive for governments to give their spin, to at least acknowledge that this issue is a challenge. And this is a way of a lot of the international human rights system works, is these administrative consequences. You issue reports, and then there's a dialogue that begins with the international bodies. And speaking of the actual obligations, human rights law comes from treaties. So they actually list out the legal obligations. And these treaties will have treaty bodies, institutions that will give commentary. If there's a violation, they'll do their own investigation, and they will give instructions to the governments how to follow these international rules. And the governments are issuing reports to these institutions, and they begin a dialogue and back and forth. And there's a lot of criticism, which is fair, that how effective is this in really helping fight human rights? We're just issuing reports. So there are some forms of pressure. Of course, the international community can agree on things like economic sanctions and forms of pressure, less intuitive forms of pressure like political pressure. These can have a real effect. And then another part of it is just compiling the data. Like I said, a lot of the source of a lot of human rights violations is invisibility. When the governments actually don't take data, for example, again, on the homeless population or an ethnic minority group, violations occur when the government doesn't keep any data on what's happening with these people, or even how many people there are. And one way that this administrative process can work is they force the government to give us information to at least identify whether violations are happening. So we also have this expression, what is it? Sunlight is the best disinfectant. The first way to stopping human rights violations is just first identifying what problems are happening, and transparency. So there are legitimate challenges with this administrative program for enforcing human rights, but there are some benefits. And governments can, recently we've been having an authoritative turn in governments, I think since 2014, especially in this region. 2014 seems to be an interesting year. Duterte came into power in 2014. Xi Jinping started his very assertive policy in China in 2014. Myanmar government started instituting really discriminatory laws against Muslims in 2014. I think there was something in the air in this period. Maybe social media might have something to do with it. This is kind of authoritarian turn. And this is also a challenge, again, for the international environment, the international community, to deal with governments that don't want to play along with the international system. So, of course, we're very fortunate. Sometimes the government will change regimes, and they will be more friendly to human rights, and they will kind of lock in institutions. Maybe this is what saved America during the Donald Trump, who was very openly anti-human rights. But we had human rights institutions kind of locked in by previous regimes that made it difficult for him. So that's kind of one way the international system can work over the long term, is they set up standards and principles you can lock in at the domestic level at certain periods to protect human rights over the long term. And one question actually Paula asked me to address is, what's really at the heart of human rights from this kind of cosmopolitan or international perspective? The really central piece, and I think I have it written down here, is, I'll get back to universal and equal in a moment, but let me talk about the next one, which is, it's about dignity, human dignity. That's really at the center of international human rights obligations. Am I okay with time? Is the equal dignity of humans and respecting the recognition of the equal humanity, and especially that other humans in the society around you, they have an equal stake in the society that they're in, and we have to respect their humanity and their equal status as humans that have a stake in the society around them. And there's a kind of rule of thumb I use, which is, there's sometimes complex cases where human rights are pushing in different directions. So for example, like with the coronavirus restrictions, you can't have groups coming together for demonstrations, but we're trying to protect health at the same time. Or, like this case of France that wants to ban head coverings because they want to respect women's rights, but they're also not allowing women that want to wear it the autonomy to do that. And you see human rights are pushing in different directions. Kind of my rule of thumb for thinking about these complex cases is really, at the end of the day, what respects the dignity of individuals or humans as equal humans, respecting their self-worth. And something like the coronavirus restrictions, you can see there's a legitimate case. We want to protect health, and really respecting the equal human, the equal humanity of others is, we need to respect their life and health so we can justify these kind of restrictions. Whereas on the France side, at least from my perspective, I think, you're doing more to attack the autonomy of women that want to wear this than you're maybe protecting women. That doesn't look like it's putting dignity of the individual or the human at the center. But that's my kind of rule of thumb, is you focus on the equal dignity of humans. And most often in practical cases, that means you side with the vulnerable. You side with the invisible. In most social cases, there's a power group and there's a vulnerable group. And the group we worry about for human rights is especially the vulnerable, the invisible, the foreigners, the homeless, LGBT minorities, even women, children. We focus on the vulnerable because they're the ones that don't have a voice in power to protect themselves. They're the ones that need the international community to speak on their behalf, or to help empower them, or to give them, protection, because they can't get that protection in their environment. So focusing on the vulnerable, focusing on the equal dignity of humans, that's really at the center of human rights from this perspective. And I think I'll have a little more time. Let me give you the two major, the complete and universal. Let me, if I can put up another slide. Goodness. Here we go. There's two major categories of human rights. Are you looking at a slide that says International Human Rights Law Basic Info right now?
We can see it.
These are the core human rights. When we talk about universal human rights, we're talking about this list right here. The original list was written by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. They made this list. In the 1960s, they were divided into two categories: ICCPR, the civil and political rights, and economic and social rights. Sometimes we call this Generation 1 and Generation 2 rights. And this will get to the point of universality and completeness. In the Cold War period, countries wanted to divide these and follow one, and they had the ideology, they had the thinking that you had to pick one side or the other, and one side would be opposite to the other. We still see this, of course, the Cold War context. So you had communist governments really siding on economic and social rights. These are rights about a decent standard of living. You have enough food to eat, you have a job, social security, education, health. And these communist governments would worry about civil and political rights are ways that basically, it's a list of ways that governments will try to silence different opinions. Oh, yes? Did you have a question?
You're okay. Go ahead.
All right. So you can see how earlier they would try to divide these, where communist governments might think, freedom of speech will make it more difficult for us to get everyone a job and get everyone healthcare. And in the opposite side, you had liberal countries, even today in America, they love free speech, but even talking about the universal right to health is still a challenge there. And they would try to oppose human rights against each other. That's just this classic way of thinking. And that's why they divided these two into these two different treaties. And the modern way of thinking about human rights is you don't pick and choose. All of these core human rights are universal. We have to take all of them together, and we now think of them as mutually reinforcing. So if you want to protect health, actually you need to protect freedom of expression. The coronavirus is a good example. Right after coronavirus broke, the government was silencing some of the doctors that were putting up complaints about it, and that made fighting the virus more difficult. So you can see how freedom of expression reinforced the right to health. And you can see in the opposite direction, in parts of Africa where you have 1/4 of the population that's HIV positive, the right to health is such an overwhelming thing. Freedom of expression doesn't mean much. The two work together. You need both categories of human rights. And that's kind of a good message for these core human rights, and especially these first two generations of civil and political rights and economic and social rights. You need to have all of these core rights and are mutually reinforcing. I think that's a good place to stop. And there's a third, the final point is, like I said, human rights law is evolving. There are new human rights, things like LGBT rights, right to environment, that are emerging. These are some challenges. But human rights law is still evolving, but the central message I want to leave is really at the center is human dignity and protecting the vulnerable and invisible. And let me stop there. And if you have questions, I'll be happy to address them. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. This, I feel like you've covered a lot of ground in a short time. This is just, such a very informative and interesting lecture. Let's open it up for about 5 minutes now for question and answers. We have a lot of participants, and you're welcome to write a question into the chat or to unmute and ask.
We have one question about comprehensive human rights.
Yes, go ahead.
Civil and political and economic and social rights, that list that I just showed you in the previous slide. This is what we consider the core human rights that are comprehensive. So because there are other human rights that are developing, and I may need to ask what you mean by comprehensive. That's the way I would think about comprehensive, is the core human rights that apply universally. They apply to every human, every culture, every gender, every age. You need to adapt them to different cultures. So cultural difference still comes in, but that's the way we think about comprehensive in these core human rights.
Okay, Dr. Mosley, I want to ask a question.
Certainly.
Okay, when you talk about human rights, so which applies for refugees also, right? Okay, so there are refugees from different world. Let's see especially what's going on right now compared to Afghanistan. So when those refugees entering a new country, let's say any country, okay, without any birth certificate, any documentation, any passport, anything, okay, do they have a basic rights to apply for a identification or a paperwork when they enter a new country? And do the country have a responsibility to grant them a visa or any identification to legalize their identity? That's what I want to ask for.
All right, well, we have refugee law. So the core standard is by the Refugee Convention, 1950 Refugee Convention. According to this one, if a person is subject to persecution inside their own country, another country has a legal obligation to give them a visa as a refugee.
But the person might be long time process, right? I mean
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what I was going to get to next. The government comes up with its own process. The definition of, for example, persecution or the process is up to the domestic government. So Japan, for example, takes very, very few refugees because they interpret persecution so narrowly, almost no one ever falls into the category. Whereas a country like Canada is very expansive. So refugee protection is sometimes only as good as the domestic government that has the commitment to protecting these people. So that's
okay. So like Canada,
politics,
Australia, like that.
Politics comes in the back door. That's another challenge of international laws. It often goes back to politics in a lot of practically.
But at least they do have the rights to apply. But whatever they can grant you the visas, or they can grant you anything that's up to them, right? Up to the government.
Yes, and then there's also forms outside of refugee protection as well. I also see some more questions in the comments. How does the UN react when the communist bloc countries break laws? Well, like I said, the modern the modern ideology of human rights laws, civil and political and economic and social rights have to come together. So when you have communist governments or any kind of government making an argument, you need to split off and not follow freedom of expression or right to privacy to protect these other rights. The UN, the UN system, the human rights system will say, no, you have to, they come together. You can't split human rights like that. And this last question, I think human rights situation in the world is getting worse. That's true. In some respects, do you think the universality is still applicable? So governments commit violations. The violations don't disappear just because the government doesn't want to acknowledge them. So we can collect data and good statistics. So in a future government, this is also, we've had violations in our past too. We still need to acknowledge. We use this by transitional government. So we want to preserve this data and this evidence, these violations, because someday in the future, there will be an accounting. We don't know how long in the future, but someday every violation we want to have an accounting for. So we collect data on these violations. So in the future, we can respect that these violations happened and, have some atonement, have some kind of process to acknowledge them. What can be the next step for international human rights? Somebody.
Quite lots of questions.
I'm afraid.
I think, are we out of time? Okay.
We're out of time. I think we should all give him a wonderful round of applause for a terrific lecture. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, everybody. It's happy to talk.
Dr. Mosley.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. We have 3 speakers today, and I'd like to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is from the Philippines, and I would like to ask Professor Valdemir Miranda to introduce our next speaker.
Okay. Good afternoon. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So to introduce the next speaker, our second speaker is a full-time faculty at the De La Salle University, Manila. He received his doctorate in history from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He held various chairmanship positions at the De La Salle University, such as academic chair for Rizaliana Studies and Marcelino Foronda for oral history. Some of his published journal articles are Sports as a National and International Integration, the case of the 1982 Manila Southeast Asian Games, EDSA 1, Decoding the People's Dream of an Unfinished Revolution, Kababaihang Sakdalista, Makata at Tunay na Mandirigma sa Likod ng Mga Tula. He has also published a book entitled Tulang Sakdal, Aral at Diwa ng Sakdalismo. Our guest speaker has also been a resource person for various engagement, the most recent of which is on Valenzuela City on COVID-19 response, first 100 days under the Bayanihan Act. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome our second guest speaker, Dr. Marlon Santiago de Lupio.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Good morning. Yes.
Okay, yes. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our organizer, participants, and fellow speaker. So I will upload my presentation. I hope you can see my presentation.
We can see it.
Okay, thank you. Wait, okay, so my topic is about human rights in the Philippines. There are three very important variables there, the title, history, its context, and issues. So roughly, I'll try to make my presentation very briefly because I'm given only about 20 to 25 minutes to present. So you can see it's around 21 slides. And I did try to make my presentation interactive. So some of the slides are pictures. And I'm hoping some of the participants who are Filipinos can help me decode some of this picture, can identify some of this picture. Okay, so history, I'll provide a very brief history of human rights. Then in context, I'll provide the context of the Philippines. Particularly right now, it's a very very relevant issue in my country. And issues, technically, the whole presentation is centered on the past Philippine president, starting from Marcos up to the present. And the main point of my presentation is to let our participants know that in the Philippines, in the context of the Philippines, the number one violator of human rights in upholding the human rights in the Philippines is the state or the government. So I will give certain issues, certain cases wherein for each president, for each past president in the Philippines, there are issues on human rights. Okay, so I'll proceed to the next one. So this is the next one. This is the most trending issue in the Philippines recently. On the left side, you can see a male, and that is the son of the former president Ferdinand Marcos, and or Bongbong Marcos. We called him Bongbong Marcos, and of course, Bongbong Marcos being interviewed in this context. So I'm sure any Filipino know the issue regarding this picture, because of course it talks about the human rights violations of the Marcos regime during the martial law years in the Philippines. So that was 1973 and up to, of course, the last term of the former President Marcos to 1986. And the next picture is this one. I'm not sure if they can identify this, or some of the participants can identify this one. So this one is an issue during the time of the former president Joseph Ejercito Estrada. So it's a case. It's a murder case. Now the alleged mastermind is no other than the president. And this one is during the time of Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, wherein a number of Filipino journalists were killed. We call this one in our country the Maguindanao massacre. The next picture is this one. So right after the People Power Revolution in 1986, one of the projects or the program that Corazon Aquino wished to implement is the Agrarian Reform Program, or more specifically, CARP, the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. So some Filipino farmers protested because of the slow implementation of the said program. So they marched to the center of, or the seat of power of government, which is Malacanang, and they were violently dispersed. And some farmers were killed during that day. This one is more recently. This one is in the case of former President Benigno Aquino III. So these are Filipino Lumads, or ethnic groups in the southern Philippines, wherein they were land grab. No? Their ancestral land were taken away forcefully by the government to be used for a government project. And lastly, this one is very, I believe, very famous. This one is, if you can see the picture, there's a symbolical meaning in the picture. Although in reality, these two are couples. There are couples, but for the Filipino, it's very symbolical. It is like mother and child. It depicts a mother and child. symbolism. So this one is during the Duterte's administration. This is the war on drugs. So basically, I have shown pictures of related issues concerning human rights from Marcos up to the current president. And the point, however, is, of course, the point is the number one violator in upholding Filipino human rights is the state or the government. Okay, so I'll proceed to the next picture, next slide. So we have to trace the history of human rights. Well, the belief and idea that everyone, by essence of his or her humanity, is entitled to certain human rights is a relatively a new mindset or a modern mindset. Its roots, however, can be traced as early as human evolution itself, but can be found in human tradition, culture, and established laws. Most early societies and civilization had traditions similar to the Golden Rule, which is do unto others as you would have others do unto you. In Filipino, we have this term, wag mong gawin sa iba ang ayaw mong gawin sa iyo. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, the Bible, the Quran, the Analects of Confucius are some examples that address people's rights and responsibilities. So this is the historical context, one of the very important variables in my title. So prior to the 20th century, some example of laws that assert individual rights are the Magna Carta in 1215, the English Bill of Rights in 1689, the French Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen, 1789, the US Constitution and Bill of Rights in 1791. But they have somehow not close to the ideal or perfection, for it excluded women's rights, people of color, certain members of ethnic minority, religious, and political groups. It took the horrors and tragedy of World War II to propel human rights into the global stage and into the global consciousness. The extermination of 6 million Jews by the Nazi, including the homosexuals and persons with disabilities that were executed during World War II. So after World War II, trials were made against peace and against humanity. After World War II, the United Nations was established with the primary goal of implementing international peace to prevent conflict or war, to make sure people from all race and walks of life will never be denied life, freedom, food, shelter. This can be traced to the basic principle of then US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which laid the basic idea of human rights, which is freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of want, and freedom of fear. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR, was adopted by the 56 members of the United Nations December 10, 1948, with a unanimous vote. The UDHR, commonly referred to as the International Magna Carta, meaning government or country's internal affairs, and its treatment to its citizens is a legitimate international concern and not simply a domestic issue. So in the context of the Philippines, we define human rights in the following definition. So it refers to the norms that aim to protect people from political, legal, and social abuses, human rights as universal and inalienable, interdependent, and indivisible, and equal and non-discriminatory based on the United Nations definition, pertains to the civil and political rights of a person living in the Philippines. And of course, we have the right to life, liberty, personal security, freedom from torture, freedom from discrimination, and freedom from arbitrary arrest, among others. So in the Philippines, the legal basis of human rights can be found in the 1987 Constitution, specifically Article 3, Section 1, which states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall any person be denied of the equal protection of the laws. So the Bill of Rights in the 1987 Constitution contains 22 provisions. And of course, the Philippines, as a signatory to the United Nations, also adhere to the United Nations International Bill of Human Rights. But of course, the problem lies if the current administration is willing to support, is willing to implement such arrangement or laws. So let's see the case, for example, this one. So human rights in the Philippines during the Marcos administration, basically last September 21, we celebrated here in the Philippines the martial law period. So this took place September 23, 1972. And this is well, for many Filipinos, they consider this as the very dark age of our history. I'm sorry for this this mark. It's in Filipino, but basically, this person is one of the victims of the martial law period. So martial law took place roughly for 14 years. We have a one-man rule, which is President Marcos. And during the martial law period, the agency that is very atrocious, committed atrocities to the Filipinos is the armed forces of the Philippines. So basically, the statistics after martial law is this one. We have 70,000 people were in prison, 43,000 were tortured, and 3,240 were killed. So many Filipino youth were murdered, were killed during this administration, during the Marcos administration. So that's why in the first picture, it's a very relevant issue with the interview with the son of the late President Marcos. And another one is this one. Of course, during the Corazon Aquino administration, we have this, we call this one the Black Thursday, wherein the Black Thursday or the Mendiola Massacre. So this is the picture of Filipino farmers that was killed in their protests to forcefully implement the comprehensive agrarian reform program. And of course, we have Fidel Valdez Ramos, the president from 1992 to 1998. Although Ramos have many programs, but of course, there's always an issue about human rights. So one issue during his presidency is the death and the murder of many Filipino journalists. So during his time, he established this one to address crime and kidnapping. He addressed this one by establishing the Presidential Anti-Crime Commission through Executive Order 221. So that was established in July 7, 1990. And during the Estrada administration from 1998 to 2001, of course, the most famous case is the Ser Corbito case. The Ser is a publicist. He promoted the presidency of Ramos. Then, of course, he promoted the presidency of Estrada. But he was killed on November 24, 2000 for allegedly giving leaked information to former Fidel Ramos about the issue on Joseph Estrada. And of course, this picture, the one that I showed you a while ago, is took place on November 23, 2009. A dozen family members of Vice Mayor Magunda Datu of Buluan traveled with them to submit their candidacy for election, and they were gunned down by the opposing candidates. So around 53 were killed during this time. So this is around 58. I'm sorry, around 58 were killed, and 32 of them are from reporters covering the incident. And of course, we have this one, as I mentioned, the Lumad killings in Mindanao by under the presidency of Benigno Aquino III. So 40,000 indigenous peoples were forcefully vacated to their ancestral homeland because for government project by building dams and electrical power in the area. And of course, we have the most recent atrocities that was committed to the Filipino people is under President Rodrigo Duterte. Based on the statistics, in 2 years of the Duterte administration, Human Rights Watch claims that over 20,000 drug suspects have been killed. And of course, there are, from July 1, 2016 to September 26, 2017, 3,906 suspected drugs users and dealers were killed. So this is the most pressing problems that the Philippines have. Because basically, how can you address human rights in the Philippines when the number one violator of which is the government or the state? So my last slide is about this one. So what can we do? So to address the issue on human rights, as professionals, what can we do? As students, what can we do? And of course, as Filipinos, what can we do to address the issue of human rights, specifically on the context of the situation in the Philippines? So that's my presentation, roughly, basically. So I'm open to any question.
Thank you. This is quite an overview of human rights in the Philippines.
Yes, in the context of the Philippines.
Yeah, let's go ahead and open it up to questions. You can write questions in chat or take off the mic as well.
I got a question for Dr. Marlon,
Yes.
if you would like to answer it. Okay. So just be careful of answer this. Okay. When it comes to international court of justice, okay, you know what's going on right now is the International Court of Justice is trying to put the Duterte in the court. So do you think it's applicable to put him in the court in there to give him what kind of duties? I mean, like that. So your opinion.
Yes.
Your opinion, okay?
In principle, each government is obliged to, in terms of international relation, is obliged to somehow consider the recommendation of the United Nations. But of course, it's up to the state or the government or the country to implement such changes or laws. So the problem with the Philippines right now is our president is not cooperative. Be
careful, answer those. Be careful.
Yes, but I'm saying the truth.
Okay.
Yes, it's not cooperative in providing
Evidence
or steps or even steps to see. Particularly, the accusation is that there are many extrajudicial killings that is happening in the Philippines for the past administration since 2016. President Duterte the term will end around 2022. So basically, the whole term of President Rodrigo Duterte is been marked by extrajudicial killings. And the problem is the head of state is not cooperative. Not cooperative with
not willing to go to court. That means in other word, right?
Yeah.
He's not willing to give any evidence. He's not willing to give any word to reply to them.
Even mandated the Philippine National Police and the Philippine Army to not support the investigative body.
Okay.
So that's a problem. That's a problem. So that's the real problem that we are facing right now. So
okay,
my last question is that how can we address this as Filipinos, as students, as teachers, as professionals?
But he's been charged with guilty anyhow, right? He's been charged, right? Or not charged? Like
President Duterte?
Yeah, he's been charged with guilty or not just still ongoing.
It's still ongoing.
Ongoing. Oh, okay.
You cannot charge the president. The president has immunity from charges.
I mean, it's from international court. From the international court that it might as a charge can direct. I don't know. I don't know about that.
Although we have this commission on human rights, but of course the most powerful, influential person in the Philippines is the chief executive, which is the president. So that's the whole point of my presentation. It is ironic that it's the government throughout our history. It's been ironic that it's the government that is the number one violator in a way. You can say that the number one violator or offender in not upholding the human rights of the Filipinos. So that's the whole essence of my presentation. So I identify not only President Duterte, but since the time of President Marcos, that was 1965. So that was 1965 up to the present.
You mean every single individual?
So every president have their own issue on human rights or violation of human rights.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Marlon.
Yes, thank you.
So I see we have another question. How have people reacted or protested the human rights violations? Has there been any progress made?
Yeah, that's the problem right now because of the pandemic. Filipinos cannot have protests in the streets that we normally do. So right now, the only way to do this one is in social media. That's the platform of protests. So the social media, Facebook account, IG account, Twitter, these are the things that we use to air our grievances. So hopefully, well, it's on the last part of the administration, the term of the president. Next year we will have our presidential election by 2022. So hopefully everything will be better. Will be better.
I have a question as well. Related
Yes.
to this. I mean, I think that President Duterte's violations of human rights are quite well known internationally, but domestically, do most Filipinos ignore that and still support him? How do most Filipinos view human rights? I mean, it seems like if they support him, then they do not support human rights. How do they see that issue?
Okay. That's a very good question. Actually, 2 days ago, we have this survey, survey about the popularity of President Rodrigo Duterte. And based on the survey, 75% of Filipinos still accept the governance of the president. But of course, you have to read the comments. You have to read the comments on the on the page. So most of the comments are in a negative and critical way. They don't believe on the 75%. They believe that the survey is, of course, in favor of the government or pro-administration. But if your basis is the social media, majority of Filipinos are very critical right now, and they express their displeasure on what's happening in the Philippines. I'm sure if there's no COVID-19, Filipinos will go and march on the streets already.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for one more question or so.
Yeah,
If there are other questions someone would like to ask? I see there's a question here in the comments.
There are still protests recently in Manila last September 21, yes, to commemorate. Actually, universities do that. Normally, universities do that. But before pandemic, it's more active. Before the COVID-19, it's more active in the Philippines. So we are restricted because of this pandemic. So we just like what I said, we push our protests, and we use social media for that to air our grievances.
Okay, it's interesting how social media is becoming important for promoting human rights in the Philippines.
Yeah, it's a very important tool.
Yeah,
Especially for the younger generation.
right.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
If there's no other questions right now, then let's everyone give him a big hand. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk on human rights. Thank you so much. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our third speaker. Our third speaker today is Dr. Kosuke Nishitani, who is a professor emeritus of Aoyama Gakuin University. He is my dear colleague who is taught with me here at Aoyama Gakuin University. He is an expert on Christian education and the role of Christian universities in societies. He has written widely on that topic, and I was delighted that he accepted the invitation to speak about human rights and Christian education. And so now I will turn to Dr. Nishitani. Go ahead. You need to put up your slides. Hold on. Let me get the slides up for you just a moment.
Konnichiwa. I'm so honored to be here like this. And my theme today is human rights and Christian education. And I'm a Japanese, so I will share, what's the next one, please? Or do you just push the button arrow down? There you go. Well, I'm old enough not to be very good at handling the internet things. So Shew Sensei, Professor Shew, is helping me a lot now. And I will firstly share with you my small experiences with the idea of human rights in Japan. It's about their acceptance of the concept of human rights. And of course, I personally have cherished the idea that every human being has a right to happy life, to live a happy life in equality and peace with others, in total freedom. And I had 35-year-long teaching experience in Christian universities in Japan as a chaplain. In the class of Christian social ethics and so on, I taught to my students a core content, so to speak, of the theme of the relationship of Christian faith and human rights thought. That's what I'm talking about secondly today. And it can be entitled Christian Derivation of Human Rights and Democracy. And the third part of my talk today is about promotion of human rights thought. How should we encourage and accelerate the movement of promoting the idea of human rights, especially for us in Japan? But I know there are the countries which are already familiar with the idea of human rights, and also there are some countries which are still feeling uneasy with the concept or the thought of human rights. So I'm going to talk about my first theme, that's acceptance of human rights by the Japanese. Yeah. Okay, the next one. Yeah. These are Article 1797 and Article 11 in our Constitution, in the Constitution of Japan. And I think I'm going to read these texts. The fundamental human rights by this Constitution guaranteed to the people of Japan are fruits of the age-old struggle of man to be free. They have survived the many exacting tests for durability and are conferred upon this and future generations in trust to be held for all time inviolate. That's 97. And Article 11 goes like this. The people shall not be prevented from enjoying any of the fundamental human rights. These fundamental human rights guaranteed to the people by this Constitution shall be conferred upon the people of this and future generations as eternal and inviolate rights. You may notice some overlapping parts and some different parts in these two articles of our Constitution. Why this overlap? That's my question. And okay. Article 97 was directly written by Courtney Whitney. He was a lawyer as well as a U.S. military officer, finally Major General. He was deeply trusted and appointed Chief of the Government Section at GHQ by Douglas MacArthur. the supreme commander of the Allies. This man was finally awarded Army Distinguished Service Medal. And this man he was responsible for drafting the chief of the government section at GHQ, with Colonel Charles Louis Cadiz as his deputy, leading the steering committee of some 30 officers drafting the Constitution. So this means our Constitution came from American people in a hidden way, so to speak. So Article 97 was Whitney's product. But it was almost eliminated by a Japanese legal officer by the name of Sato in the US-Japan consultation on the draft, saying the sentence is too literary for a text of law. However, an American member of the committee suggested it should be kept. So it is as is now. My conclusion here is I make much of this Article 97 because it beautifully testifies the precious history of the becoming of human rights, suggesting the Christian age-old struggle behind it. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was proclaimed in 1948. Okay, let's go skip over this. And next, I'm going to introduce you a very interesting line from a Japanese movie. I will read it. Human rights, human rights, human rights. You know what is at stake? It's human rights that are guaranteed in our Constitution. This line is from a Japanese movie, Light Makeup. There happens an explosion of a mine. The bad guy, the leading character of the movie, a serial killer on the run while disguising as a citizen, screams these words to the company executives responsible for the victim miners of the explosion and gets far more compensation for them, his fellow workers and their families, as well as a lot more bribe to himself than expected. The story was based on a true fact, happened in 1949 in Shikoku Island. We have 4 islands in Japan. Shikoku is one of them. It was only 3 years after the promulgation of the Constitution of Japan, 1 year after the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The guy knew the effect of the term human rights, whether or not he really understood the concept of the term. Yes. All right. Anyhow, the concept of human rights was quickly spread over Japan after the Constitution and the Declaration. Of course, intellectual people knew the concept of human rights and studied it in the Meiji period, more than 100 years before this. But the concept of human rights really spread among Japanese ordinary people after World War II, after the Constitution and the Declaration. The above episode indicates the impact of the concept among Japanese people then, yearning for a new polity and liberation. The case seems exclusively motivated by the economic effect of the term of human rights. However, this is my conclusion here. The Japanese, in general, seem to have calmly accepted the concept because they had been used to similar humanitarian teachings of their own traditional Buddhism or matriarchal teachings of Nipponism. This is an implicit but deep-rooted national religion of Japan, according to me. Well, I'm going to talk about Christian derivation of human rights and democracy. I'm going to read what I wrote. It has been generally said, especially in Europe, that human rights and democracy was initiated by the French Revolution and its Declaration of Human and Civil Rights in 1789. It had 17 articles. It is certainly true to some degree because after this, many European countries issued their own democratic constitutions. And French jurists and political scientists also said this, referring to the thought of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for instance. In Japan, too, it has been believed so because the first Japanese modern universities like Tokyo universities, some 140 years ago, were founded following the example of German universities. So they were informed about the matter in the same way. Democracy began with the French Revolution. However, among German jurists, Georg Jelinek demonstrated that the idea of human rights was imported to France before the revolution through French military officers such as Lafayette, who supported the American Revolution of Independence against England and learned the contents of the constitutions of the 13 American states then. Jelinek led us to eventually realize or recognize that the essential ideals of human rights and democracy came to America from the English Puritan Revolution in 160s, in spite of the juridical differences between England and America. To prove this, excuse me, just a moment. To prove this, it may be helpful to take a typical illustration. That's the item of the religious freedom. The first item of human rights catalog is the religious freedom, as you know. This seems to be based on the following idea expressed in Agreement of the People in 1647, one of the most important legal documents of the Puritans. It goes like this: matters of religion and the ways of God's worship are not at all entrusted by us to any human power, like that of an English king. And this has much to do with the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. And it goes, just as you know, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting its free exercise. And in this connection, I'd like to refer to the name of Roger Williams, a Puritan Baptist pastor, the founder of Rhode Island as the state of religious freedom. He contributed much to embedding the idea of religious freedom in American wilderness. So next one. Well, this I skipped over.
I'm gonna go back.
Yeah.
I do. You want to go back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. This one. So thus, we can historically trace the becoming of human rights and democracy has its roots in the English Puritan Revolution. Then it developed through the American Independence Revolution and the French Civil Revolution to the world now. So my conclusion here is this: all Christian schools, colleges, and universities need not to shallowly boast of this Christian heritage of human rights and democracy to the outside world, but should be quite aware of this and feel deeply responsible for teaching it with academic, historical preciseness to their pupils and students, so that they may be inwardly convinced of this precious spiritual Christian tradition of mankind. I put down Jelinek's book and Trochil's book here. You can get them still now. So why not read those books? My third point is syncretic fusion of human rights and various national religions, cultures, and traditions. How should we promote the ideals of human rights to the peoples of the world? There are many problems and barriers for sure. There are racial discrimination, sexual discrimination, handicapped person discrimination, minority discrimination, ethnic discrimination, and hate crimes, speeches, or child abuse, or domestic violence, or terror and war. We know these facts, but we have to still make efforts to overcome these human rights problems. And I think we need some devices and contrivances to promote the idea. But the most important thing is enthusiasm for promoting the idea in our classes. The Faculty of Law, Aoyama Gakuin University, is now advancing the so-called visualized course of human rights instead of boring explanation of each law text concerning human rights in the classes of the Department of Law. It's done by some good old professor like me. Well, and the second, there are some problematic countries against promoting the idea of human rights. A very politically monolithic, despotic, totalitarian state, or some religiously monolithic, fundamentalistic countries. I think we should send out a message very strongly to encourage the human rights to these areas, to these peoples of these areas of the world. Okay. So. Maybe this. All right. So I believe these these principles of Christian education and human rights. The first thing is we have to hold fast to the basic teaching of the Christian historical derivation of human rights. And to do so, we better let students to remember some spiritual cliche, such as liberty, equality, and fraternity, so that they may remember what was taught in Christian schools about human rights. And maybe, possibly, those students can remember the constitutional catalog of the rights of freedom. And in Japan, I feel this very strongly, because Japanese society is of cultures and traditions so different from Christian ones. So we have to promote the ideas of human rights to these Japanese people. We have to make the effort to discover the teachings of different religions, cultures, and traditions, like Buddhism or Confucianism, similar to human rights teachings of our own tradition, and compare and reconcile them. I think that's a very effective way to let other peoples to be persuaded into human rights thinking. And I think these days people emphasize on anthropology and global ethics. And in anthropology and global ethics, we can find many common facets, and also we can face urgent global ethical tasks like climate change. And with these issues, we can share the precious value of human rights thought. And this is all what I wanted to say today.
Okay.
I'm finished.
All right. All right. Thank you. Let me share your screen here. Thank you very much, Professor Nishitani. Very expansive treatment of human rights here in Japan and around the world. Let's go into a time of question and answer now. Do we have some questions for Professor Nishitani? And I'll invite people to take off their mic and go ahead and say their question.
Well, I just really little question for you and for both of you. Okay, Dr. Paul and Dr. Nishitani. How do I pronounce that? Nishitani, right?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay. It's a Christian subject, part of a curriculum for elementary school to the college. I'm not from Japan, so it's actually part of a curriculum in Japan, from elementary to the college. I mean, should every school practice Christianity subjects in Japan? Okay.
Human rights is not a required subject at Aoyama Gakuin. However, I would say that courses on the Bible or Christianity are a required subject of
in Japan,
all students at the Christian schools. At the like Aoyama Gakuin University, we are a Christian university, so we have a required course on classes, and in those classes, we also talk about human rights.
Okay, so it depends. It depends. Yeah, it depends on the school.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But it's not necessarily a part of the curriculum of other schools.
Okay. I'm not familiar in Japan. That's why. Okay, so it's same here in the Philippines. So okay.
Maybe let me push a little further about that thing, because I'm very interested in it. Is there any way, can you share any kind of example or stories how you handle the human rights issue in the class of Christian education?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Well, I please repeat it again. I'm not an English speaker.
I'll repeat the question.
Yeah.
So he wants to know how you dealt with the issue of human rights in your classes on Christianity. キリスト教をキリスト概論とかキリスト教を教えている中でどのように人権教育を取り上げるのかっていうことです。
Well, human rights are a very familiar term among the Japanese right now, but they really don't know what is at stake in the thought of human rights. So I very give some illustrations, just like what I said about the movie, very concretely. And then students will begin to understand the importance of human rights thinking. So I've got some other illustrations, but I did not mention them today. So many concrete events and problems that these people are facing. These days, I'm taking the problems of LGBT troubles. And some students are really, they're concerned about the problem, and they don't mention it before other students and even before me, but through in their reports in my class, they can confess their minority character or their real problems. And then I can understand what's going on with him or her. So sometimes I talk to these people very respectively, I mean, individually. And that's what I'm doing in my class, especially in the Christian social ethics or Christian, what's that? Biological class. I mean,
Christian biological
yeah,
ethics.
Christian biological ethics. Was that enough?
And we have another question here, I see, which is the Constitution of Japan made by the U.S. Occupational Authority in Japan and the Supreme Allied Commander, Pacific. Did it somehow got a little bit of reform as time goes on by the Japanese itself? So the Japanese, asking specifically about the Japanese Constitution, has Japan changed that its own, or is it still just as it was given by the occupational authorities?
Well, there are two peoples in Japan who are very much still against this fact. I mean, our Constitution was in a hidden way, but substantially given from the American side. But there are some people who are really satisfied with the fact, because Japanese people could be changed by that Constitution in a sense fundamentally, and they liked it because they didn't like the militaristic, how do you say? Constitution before. I mean, the government was so militaristic, and they really didn't like it. So Douglas MacArthur could be called another emperor for Japan, even. So they really welcomed him, and with his draft of democratic constitution. And I am one of these side people.
So the Constitution in Japan has not been changed since then. And but there's some people who want to change it, and many Japanese who do not want to change it. It's a controversy right now. Actually, the government in Japan now wants to change it. The party in power wants to change it, but I think about half or more than half Japanese do not want to change the Constitution at all. It's a very controversial issue right now.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. But if we don't have one, that is just fine as well. Oh, okay, here I see one. How is the LGBT issue, the LGBT rights issue in Japan?
Well, it's said here in Japan, maybe 1 or 2 out of 20 people, I mean, a little more than that, 13% of the whole population of Japan are facing LGBT problems. That means they are that sexual minority. And I've noticed that maybe 15 years ago, and 10 years ago, I was convinced that I have some of those students in my class, maybe 50 students or 100 students. And so I became, what shall I say? I thought I should talk about this problem in my Christian social ethics. And after I began it, then many students would come to me confessing their problems or their agonies. So I thought it was so good for me to decide to begin that theme in my class.
Yeah, yeah. It's still not widely accepted in Japanese society, but in the schools, we have begun to take it very seriously because it's obviously an issue, and in terms of supporting students, it's very important. So I've seen in schools very strong support for our LGBTQ students, and also even faculty and staff as well.
これは多分クリスチャンスクールだからやってることで。
Yeah, yeah, and in Japan, and Dr. Nishani said that, yeah, and that's because we're Christian schools. In Japan, the Christian schools have always been promoting human rights and human dignity, and so we were early to notice those problems of those students and to try to help them, whereas the regular public schools are not so open to helping those students. But the Christian schools, especially because of our focus on human rights and dignity and those kinds of things, we tend to be more sensitive and have been much more open about supporting those students in our schools. Yeah, thanks. That was a great question. And I think we are just about out of time for today. This has been a very interesting discussion on human rights from different perspectives. At this point, I would like to invite Dr. Youngmin Pike from Yonsei University to give some closing remarks and announcements.
Thank you, Dr. Shew, for the wonderful leadership. And let me say this one. Yes, we have continued this monthly forum the last 1 year with the theme of the education in this post and during the pandemic world. So that is our proposal, to find what should be the direction we need to take and what kind of things, we can try together, as a people of God together in this Christian education and institution. So I just want to remind all of you, and please be the part of this kind of great movement together. So let me share the one screen. So first of all, I want to thank, give thanks, to the wonderful speakers today and the organizers and the participants. Our discussion, will open door, for the new world. And the second one is that we're going to continue this monthly forum every month, and maybe we're going to get into more detailed human rights issue for next month. It's going to be on October 30th, 2021 at the same time. So please come together we're going to talk about the education and women's right. And so we're going to be more specific in the issue of women's right next month. So please be together with us. And also I'm asking all of you, please stay safe in this COVID-19 pandemic world. Thank you very much. And it was the pleasure to be together with you. And this time I'm trying to invite Dr. Nija Mashi, from India, to close our whole meeting with a prayer.
Thank you, Dr. Pat. Am I audible now?
We can hear you.
We have little the echo.
Echo problem. Now, is it fine? Shall we close our eyes for a word of prayer? Precious and loving Father, thank you, Lord, for this lovely day in our lives that we all could gather together in your name at this APAMEI monthly forum and discuss on the international human rights. Thank you for the speakers that you, Dr. Nishitani, Dr. Marlon, and Dr. Mosley. Dear Lord, as we listen to them, help us to take home the lessons and be custodian of the world that you have so beautifully made. Your greatest commandment, love thy neighbor and do unto others as you will have do unto you. So if we always take this into consideration, all the issues about the human rights will be taken care of. So dear Lord, as we go back to our respective places and respective jobs and be the citizens in our countries, help us to spread this message. And also, dear Lord, we once again commit each one of us into your mighty hands and ask this prayer in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, especially for our wonderful speakers. Another big hand of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming out and joining today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Thank you.
Hope to see you next month. Thank you.